It's late. The stars are silent above the thick thatched roofs of a sleeping village, tucked in some forgotten corner of medieval Europe. The world outside is quiet now, except for the soft chirp of insects and the occasional bark of a dog guarding the dark. You'd think everyone would be asleep by now, curled under rough woolen blankets, resting after a long day of labor. But not everyone is. In fact, this is when something very strange begins. You see, in the medieval world, sleep wasn't what we think it is today. It didn't always come in one long stretch. People didn't always go to bed at 10 and wake up at 7. Instead, they followed rhythms we might now find confusing, even a little bizarre. People often slept in two parts, first sleep and second sleep, with a strange, mysterious middle-of-the-night gap where things happened. Quiet things, strange things, sometimes even dangerous things. You might wonder why. Why do people wake up in the middle of the night on purpose? What are they doing in the dark hours, lit only by flickering candles or the faint glow of a hearth fire? The answer is more human than you'd expect. Some people prayed. Some read. Others, well, let's just say not all midnight activities were so innocent. The deeper you go into the daily life of the medieval world, the more unusual details you'll find. People's sleep habits were shaped by things we no longer think about. The sound of livestock rustling nearby, the cold that seeped in through stone walls, the fear of fire or rats or spirits they believed lurked in the corners of the dark. Beds weren't always private. In fact, they were often shared, not just by couples but by strangers, traveling merchants, or even entire families. And then there was the matter of what they slept on. Feather beds were rare luxuries. Most people, peasants, workers, servants, slept on straw mattresses that smelled of hay, sometimes moldy, often crawling with the same insects that plagued the fields. Pillows? Maybe if you were lucky. Covers were often just old cloaks or patched-together bits of wool. If you were a serf, you might sleep in the same clothes you worked in, covered in the dust of the day. Now imagine this. It's the year 1357. A young girl named Annette is lying on her straw mattress in a cramped wooden cottage. Her younger brother is already asleep beside her, snoring gently. Outside, the wind howls across the moors. Their mother hums softly in the next room, kneading the dough for tomorrow's bread by candlelight. The fire crackles low. Annette isn't asleep yet. She's listening to the quiet footsteps on the road outside. A neighbor heading to the church, perhaps? Or something else, because this was the time when people believed things stirred in the night. Not just humans, spirits, ghosts, creatures of the dark. Stories passed down from old grandmothers warned of wandering souls and glowing eyes in the woods. And so, between first sleep and second sleep, many families would huddle close. Some prayed aloud, some whispered tales to keep the children still, and sometimes they listened for the sound of scratching at the door. This unusual rhythm, this split sleep pattern, was completely normal for people back then. Scholars would later call it segmented sleep. But to them, it was just life. The gap between the two sleeps wasn't wasted time. It was a precious window. It was time to get things done that couldn't be done during the day. Letters were written. Firewood was checked. Even marriages, oddly enough, were sometimes consummated between these two halves of the night. In towns and cities, the pattern held, too, though the noise was different. The clatter of horse hooves in cobbled streets, the soft murmurs from alehouses, the muttering of monks during their midnight chants. For the wealthy, sleep happened in tall wooden beds with thick drapes, separating them from servants who sometimes slept at their feet. In castles, there was a strange mix of luxury and discomfort. Heavy blankets and thick mattresses, yes, but also cold stone walls and the ever-present chill of drafty halls. In monasteries, the monks had their own strange habits. They would rise in the middle of the night for matins, a holy prayer session held in near darkness. The air would be freezing. Their breath would cloud in the air. Yet they would sit in silence, reciting verses, half asleep, half awake. It was devotion. It was discipline. But it was also deeply tied to the rhythm of the old world. Even dreams were thought of differently. People believed dreams were messages, sometimes divine, sometimes demonic. You didn't just wake up and forget them. You talked about them, interpreted them. A nightmare wasn't just a bad sleep. It was a warning. But let's come back to Annette. She's not asleep yet. The fire is low. Her mother has finished her dough and now sits with her knitting, slowly, rhythmically weaving in the quiet. Annette hears the floorboards creak. Was it the wind? A rat? Or was it someone outside, walking past the cottage, their shoes crunching softly in the frost? She isn't sure, but this is what the night was like back then. Restless, alive, filled with sounds and thoughts and fears that we, today, have forgotten. There's more, too. Sleep wasn't always private. In inns, especially, travelers shared beds. Not just couples or families, but total strangers. There were bed-sharing customs. If someone asked politely and paid the fee, they could climb in beside you. No questions asked. People called them bedfellows. It was normal and awkward, but in a world without enough beds, it was practical. And believe it or not, some people even paid to watch others sleep. Yes, really. In some towns, especially during festivals, strange performances took place where people would watch sleepwalkers, dreamers, or those pretending to speak in tongues during sleep. The line between superstition and entertainment was thin, and yet the strangest habit might not be any of those. It might be what people believed about sleep itself. Many believed sleep was a gift from God, but only if it came at the right time. Sleeping too much was seen as laziness, even sinful. And so, if someone was seen napping during the day, they might be punished. Others believed too little sleep could drive you mad, possessed by demons or riddled with melancholy. So people had a balance. Not too much, not too little, and always with the fear of something creeping just beyond the edge of the firelight. And now, back in that little wooden cottage, Annette finally begins to drift off. Her breathing slows. The wind outside quiets for a moment. Her mother blows out the last candle. But just as sleep takes her, the dog growls. Softly, low. Its ears perk up. Something is moving outside. Slowly, deliberately, and the door creaks. Annette didn't open her eyes at first. She lay still beneath her thin blanket, barely breathing, her hand brushing against her brother's. The fire was almost out now. Just a few glowing embers cracked in the hearth, faint and fading. She wasn't sure if the sound had been real. Maybe the door hadn't creaked. Maybe the dog hadn't growled. But something in the air had changed. It felt different, like the night had suddenly become thicker. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the shutters. They rattled gently, then went quiet. Annette finally opened one eye, slowly, just enough to see the ceiling beams above her bed. Shadows danced softly along the wood. Nothing moved. The dog gave one last low whine and settled down again. She told herself it had been nothing. A fox, or the wind, or maybe one of the neighbors coming home from the church. Some people visited the chapel between sleeps, especially on colder nights. The church was always warm from the candles, and the priest welcomed late visitors, those who needed comfort or forgiveness, or just a place to feel less alone. She had been there once, in the middle of the night, holding her mother's hand while snow piled quietly outside. This middle part of the night, this waking gap between sleeps, it wasn't always frightening. It was just a time people used. Her mother would sometimes sew or whisper prayers or warm a cup of milk by the fire. Annette liked those moments best. The world felt softer then, slower, almost secret. In other homes, families used this time differently. Fathers might mend tools by the light of an oil lamp. Mothers might nurse infants or check on the animals outside. In villages farther south, shepherds would walk their pastures by moonlight to keep watch over sleeping flocks. And in the cities, where the air was filled with the smells of coal smoke and ale, people stirred in their beds, whispering gossip or sneaking out into the streets for reasons better left unspoken. Sleep was not simple. It was layered, messy, often broken by noise or cold. Curtains, if they existed, were used not for style but for warmth, hung around beds to keep out the chill. In wealthy homes, tapestries covered walls to trap heat. In poorer cottages like Annette's, there was little between you and the night but the walls, and even those creaked. Sleep wasn't private either. In most households, the entire family slept in one room. The idea of bedrooms didn't exist for common folk. Children slept beside parents, elders at the edge. In some homes, even animals slept indoors. A piglet in the corner, a chicken or two roosting beside the hearth. Their warmth helped through winter. And yet, somehow, people found peace in these crowded, drafty spaces. Maybe because they were used to it. Maybe because the world outside was often more uncertain than the one inside. Thieves, fires, wolves, disease, or rumors. Rumors could spread fast in the dark, especially when people woke and whispered between sleeps. In the monastery outside the village, the monks were stirring now. Cold stone walls echoed with soft footsteps as they filed silently into the chapel for their night prayers. They did this every night at the same hour. Chanting began slowly, rising and falling like wind in the trees. It wasn't music, not exactly, but it was calming. Many villagers said they could feel it even from miles away, like the rhythm of the earth itself. Some noble households kept strict rules about sleep. Servants had to wake before dawn and were expected to sleep only after all duties were done. Their beds were hard, wooden boards with sacks of straw or moss. And still, they found sleep when they could. In corners, on stools, by kitchen fires. The nobility had strange habits of their own. Some believed certain sleeping positions affected dreams. Others insisted on drinking herbs or wine before bed. A few slept sitting up, believing lying flat invited death or demons. Odd beliefs were common. One old knight claimed he only slept with a blade beside him, convinced that evil spirits prowled in silence and could be fought off if he woke fast enough. His wife, so the story goes, eventually moved to another room, if only to get some peace. Annette's mother stirred in the next room. There was the soft sound of fabric rustling, and then the wooden stool creaked as she sat again. Annette heard her murmur something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps just talking to herself, and the calm of that sound made her breathe easier. She glanced at her brother, still fast asleep. His mouth hung open slightly. One hand flopped across the straw-stuffed pillow they shared. He was always the better sleeper. Nothing woke him, not even thunder. She sometimes envied him for that. The embers in the hearth gave a soft pop. One last flicker of orange danced across the ceiling, then faded again. Annette watched the shadows shift. She didn't mind being awake like this. There was something comforting in the quiet. Something safe, even if it felt odd. In villages across the kingdom, other children were likely awake too, lying quietly, listening, thinking. Maybe somewhere a midwife was helping deliver a baby in the dark. Maybe a shepherd was repairing a torn boot. Maybe a lonely traveler was watching the stars from a cold roadside. No clocks ticked. No alarms waited. The hours were counted by memory and instinct. People rose when the rooster crowed or the sky turned gray, not because of time, but because of rhythm. They lived by the sun and the seasons, not numbers. And yet they understood rest. Maybe more than we do. Rest wasn't just sleep. It was stillness. It was listening. It was watching flames dance in the dark and letting your mind wander gently between thoughts. Annette shifted under the blanket. She reached for the edge of her brother's cloak and pulled it over her feet. Her body was tired, but her mind felt soft and open, as if it drifted like smoke. She wondered what her dreams would be tonight. She always dreamed in colors. Sometimes fields, sometimes animals. Once she dreamed of floating down a river where the water turned to glass and her reflection looked older than she was. Her mother had told her dreams were a gift, that the saints sent them, or sometimes warnings. She said if you dreamed of water, you were meant to listen. If you dreamed of fire, you were meant to be careful. Annette dreamed of both. And far away, in a larger house, a merchant sat awake by his desk, scribbling notes by candlelight. He had woken an hour ago, unable to sleep. He often used the space between his sleeps to work, his mind clearer then. He believed ideas were born in the dark when the world was silent. He wasn't wrong. Many poems, prayers, and inventions were first written in the middle of the night. In another town, an old woman sat alone by a window, spinning wool with her fingers. She never slept long. Her bones ached in the cold. So she watched the stars and thought of people she had loved long ago, now gone. She never spoke their names aloud, but in the silence, she felt them beside her. So many stories, quiet, forgotten, were unfolding at this very hour across the medieval world, between one sleep and the next. Some warm, some sad, some strange. And Annette, still listening to the soft breathing of her family, began to drift again. Her eyes fluttered closed. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the wind pushing gently against the shutters. But just before her thoughts disappeared into dreams, the dog growled again. And this time it didn't stop. The dog didn't bark. It just growled, low and steady, like a warning only meant for those who were paying close attention. Annette's eyelids fluttered, not quite opening. Somewhere between sleep and waking, her body felt heavy, like it belonged to the bed. But her ears were alert, listening. The growl wasn't loud, but it was clear. A quiet message from an animal that sensed something wasn't quite right. She didn't move. Not yet. She waited, half dreaming, wondering if maybe it was just the dog talking in its sleep. Dogs did that sometimes. They twitched, they whined, they muttered into the darkness, just like people. But this didn't sound like that. This sounded like a warning. Then silence returned. Not just the absence of noise, but that deep, almost eerie stillness where every sound has vanished, like the world is holding its breath. Even the wind outside had quieted. No crackling from the fire. No shifting from her mother's chair. No hoot from a barn owl that sometimes landed on the roof. Just stillness. Annette's eyes opened. The fire had completely gone out now, and the room was darker than before. She could still see the faint shape of her brother beside her, still breathing, still dreaming. Then came a sound, a single soft tap. Not loud, not rushed, just deliberate. It came from the door. One tap, then silence again. Annette's hand moved under the blanket, instinctively reaching for her brother's arm. She didn't wake him. She just needed to feel that he was there. Warm, real. Her mother hadn't moved. At least, not that she could hear. Maybe she was asleep now, too. Then another tap, a little louder this time. The dog whimpered. It wasn't unusual for people to knock at odd hours. A neighbor in trouble, a traveler lost, even a priest delivering a message in the night. But there was something about this knock, soft, slow, almost unsure, that made it feel different. Like someone standing outside wasn't certain they wanted to be let in. Or maybe they didn't want to be heard. In medieval times, homes weren't locked the way we think of today. Both were simple. Some cottages didn't even have real doors, just heavy wood pushed closed with a latch. In cities, people sometimes placed iron bars or large stones behind their doors at night. But in villages like this one, people relied more on trust and hope. The fear of intruders was real, though. Bandits, thieves, even desperate peasants, hungry or cold, might try to sneak in and steal a bit of bread or dried meat. But most people weren't dangerous. Most were just poor, just tired, just human. Still, the dog's growl meant something. Annette didn't move from her bed. She watched the faint shadow of the door from across the room. No light shone beneath it. Whoever was outside wasn't carrying a torch or a lantern. That was strange. Most visitors at night brought light with them. It helped announce good intentions. It helped show you weren't trying to hide. She wondered if her mother was awake. She almost whispered her name, but didn't. Something told her not to. The kind of something you feel in your chest, not your head. She waited. Nothing happened. No more knocks. No voices. No footsteps walking away. Just stillness again. And then, slowly, she began to drift again. Not out of safety, but exhaustion. Her body pulled her down into warmth and darkness. The way a tired mind chooses sleep over worry. Across the village, other families were stirring from their first sleep. A baker named Thomas was already kneading dough in his small kitchen, dusted with flour and yawning between pushes. He liked the quiet hours, so they made him feel like the world belonged only to him. His dog slept curled by the oven, snoring gently. In the house near the old well, a mother rocked her newborn by candlelight. The baby had colic, cried most nights. She whispered lullabies passed down from her grandmother, in a language her husband didn't speak. It didn't matter. The baby knew her voice. 2 fields over, an old man named Brand sat alone on a wooden bench near his fire pit. He hadn't slept properly in years. He said his dreams were too loud. So he smoked his pipe and stared at the flames. Sometimes he told stories to the fire, as if it were an old friend who had stayed behind when others had gone. Not far from the village, in the monastery's tall chapel, the monks had finished their chanting. They bowed their heads together and then silently returned to their cold stone rooms. Their sleep would come in short bursts. They were used to that. Their lives were built around hours, bells, and obedience. Even their rest was scheduled. But back in the little wooden cottage where Annette lay, something had changed. She didn't know when she'd fallen asleep again. The moment was gone, like mist. But the next thing she felt was warmth, sunlight filtering through the shutters, soft and golden, warming her cheeks. Birds were chirping. The dog was gone from the hearth, probably scratching around the garden or sniffing near the fence. Her brother was still asleep beside her, turned the other way now, drooling into the pillow. She sat up slowly, blinking against the light. Her mother was already up, as always. The sound of a wooden spoon stirring a pot echoed gently from the next room. Something smelled warm and simple, maybe barley porridge or boiled roots. Annette stood quietly, stepping over the worn floor, and peeked out the window. Nothing unusual. The village looked the same. Thatched roofs, chickens pecking the dirt, a neighbor leading a goat by its rope, smoke rising from nearby chimneys. All of it so normal, so peaceful. She walked to the door, heart still unsure, and pulled it open. The frost had melted. Dew clung to the grass. The sky was wide and pale blue. But something on the ground caught her eye. A footprint. Just one. Pressed deep into the mud just outside the doorway. Not a boot print. Barefoot. It was small, like a child's. But no child in the village would walk alone in the night. Especially not without shoes. Especially not to her door. She closed the door gently, not frightened, but curious. She didn't say anything. Not yet. Not even to her mother. Some things were better left until later, when the sun was higher and the strange thoughts of the night faded into the comfort of the day. But deep down, something inside her knew this wasn't the end of it. There were still questions waiting in the dark corners of the night. And the next time the dog growled, she would be ready. Later that morning, as the sun crept higher above the cottage roof, Annette sat quietly near the garden, picking tiny weeds from between the onions. The ground was still a little damp from the early frost, and her fingers tingled with cold. Birds fluttered overhead, calling out to each other in short, chirpy bursts, as if announcing the business of the day. She hadn't mentioned the footprint. Not to her mother. Not to her brother. It didn't feel like the right time. Besides, strange things happened now and then, things that couldn't always be explained. People in the village said it was best not to go poking around in questions that didn't ask to be answered. Still, the shape of that footprint lingered in her mind. It had looked soft, small, too small, perhaps, to be from someone grown, and barefoot in the cold. Even the poorest children wrapped their feet in wool scraps or straw if they had to go out in the morning chill. She looked up at the hill that bordered the village. Just past, it was the edge of the forest, deep and thick, filled with old trees and older stories. People said the woods were safe during the day, but at night, no one wandered far. Not unless they had to. Not unless something or someone was calling. Her mother's voice rang out from the cottage. Time for chores. Annette brushed her hands off on her skirt and stood. She glanced once more toward the hill, then walked back inside. The rhythm of the day returned, as it always did. Wood needed chopping. Water had to be carried from the well. A neighbor's cow had broken a fence, and everyone took turns helping fix it. In the background, the quiet hum of life continued. The smith hammered iron near the edge of the lane. Children played a game with stones and sticks, shouting and laughing in bursts. A cart creaked down the road, pulled by a sleepy-looking mule. Life in a medieval village moved slowly, but never really stopped. Everyone worked. Even the youngest children were expected to help in some way, feeding chickens, picking herbs, watching over smaller siblings. There were no days off, no holidays unless they were church days, and even then, meals still had to be cooked, animals fed, floors swept. People didn't complain much. They were used to it. used to the aches in their backs and the dirt under their nails, used to the rhythm of seasons, the rise and fall of the sun, the weight of time measured by planting and harvest. They found joy in small things, a warm stew, a dry roof, a good joke told beside a fire. That night, Annette went to bed a little earlier than usual. Her brother was already curled under the blanket, snoring gently. Her mother was still finishing something by candlelight, mending a tear in her apron. The dog had settled once more near the hearth, its tail tucked close, eyes already closed. She watched the flame dance on the wall for a long time. Her thoughts drifted gently, not anxious, just open. She thought about the footprint, about the woods, about how quiet the village always felt in the early hours, like it was holding secrets it didn't know how to speak. Eventually, her eyes closed. Sometime deep in the night, she stirred again. This time, not because of sound, but because of a dream. It had come all at once. Not frightening, not even clear, just strange. A face, but not one she recognized. A child, standing at the edge of the woods, looking back at her. Not smiling, not speaking, just standing there, as still as a statue. Behind him, the trees were full of white birds, their wings rustling like dry leaves. When she woke, the house was quiet again. Her brother breathed softly beside her. The dog hadn't moved, but outside, the wind had returned. It whispered against the shutters, brushing them gently. A familiar sound, but this time it carried something with it. Something like a hum, or a voice. Not words exactly, just a feeling of sound. Annette didn't feel afraid, just alert. She sat up, quietly pulled her blanket aside, and crept to the window. She pushed the shutter just enough to see outside. The moon was full, sitting heavy above the treetops. And just near the edge of the field, before the forest began, something moved. A flicker, like a shadow, or the hem of a cloak. But when she blinked, it was gone. She closed the shutter slowly and returned to bed. Sleep came back to her gently, like it had been waiting. And when she dreamed again, it was of birds flying low over the field. They didn't make a sound, just glided, feather silent, across the sky. Morning came with a soft golden light and the smell of oatcakes. Her mother was humming in the kitchen, her hair pinned loosely behind her ears. The world felt the same. Safe, calm. But Annette knew something had changed. Not just in the night, but in her. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself. And deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Because in the quiet spaces between waking and sleeping, in the hidden hours of the medieval night, some questions weren't meant to be answered. Some are meant only to be carried, like a stone in your pocket, warm from your hand, and silent. The days passed quietly after that. The strange dream, the footprint, the whispering wind, they all faded slowly into the soft background of Annette's thoughts. Life continued as it always had. Firewood was gathered. Lentils were boiled. The village children chased each other through the field beside the chapel, their laughter skipping like stones across the silence. No one mentioned anything unusual. Not the neighbors, not the priest, not even old Bran, who normally had something odd to say when the air turned strange. He just sat outside his cottage with his pipe, watching the chickens and whittling bits of wood into shapes that didn't quite look like anything. On the fifth night after the dream, something subtle happened again. Annette had fallen asleep easily. Her day had been full, scrubbing clothes in the cold water of the stream, then helping patch the chicken coop. Her arms ached from the labor, but in a good way. Honest tiredness. Her brother had been unusually quiet all evening, not sulking, just thoughtful. He'd looked out the window more than usual, as though trying to see something far off in the dark. And that night, as she drifted to sleep, there were no strange knocks. No growl from the dog, only stillness. But in the morning, when she stepped outside to fetch water, she saw it again. Another footprint. This time, too, one near the door, the other just a few steps away, toward the well. Still barefoot, still small, but this time thinner, like the foot that Maida had pressed more gently, as though whoever left it had started to fade. She stared at them for a while before moving. The footprints weren't deep like before. The earth had been dry, but not hard. It should have shown more shape. But instead, it looked almost brushed, like someone had passed through air, not soil. She didn't speak of it, but she kept it with her. That evening, she visited the old woman who lived at the edge of the forest. Her name was Milda. Some called her strange, but Annette's mother said she was simply old, and old women were allowed their quiet ways. Milda had lived through more winters than anyone in the village, and she remembered things others had forgotten. Her cottage smelled of dried flowers and candle wax. Herbs hung from the ceiling in bundles, brushing the tops of heads when a wind blew the door open. She gave Annette a bit of apple tea and listened without interrupting as the girl spoke. Not about the dream or the voice, but about the footprints. Milda didn't react right away. She stirred the tea slowly, looking out her small round window, where the edge of the woods could just be seen through the curtain of drying lavender. Then she said, "Children sometimes walk at night. Not all of them are meant to." Annette blinked. "You mean dreams?" "Some dreams walk further than others." The old woman didn't explain. She never did. But she reached into a drawer and handed Annette a small cloth pouch. "Hang this near your bed," she said. "Not to stop the dreams, just to remind them where they belong." The pouch smelled of rosemary and crushed juniper. That night, Annette hung it above her headboard and lay quietly under the blanket. The scent filled the room, calming and sharp, like walking through an old forest in early spring. The dog seemed more at ease that night. No growling, no pacing, just a deep, steady sleep. And her dream that night was different. She stood in a field under a full moon. The grass glowed silver, and the sky shimmered with low stars. In front of her stood the same child, the one from the earlier dream, but this time he was smiling. He said nothing, just pointed. Behind him, a trail of light wound through the grass, leading toward the trees. Annette didn't follow. She only watched, and when she woke, there was a small feather on her windowsill. Pale gray, soft, no larger than her finger. She touched it but didn't move it. Instead, she smiled, just a little, and went to start the morning fire. The days turned colder, inching slowly toward winter. Smoke hung longer in the air each morning, and the animals grew thicker coats. People wrapped themselves tighter, moved slower, and made sure their roofs were patched before the frost became heavy. Stories began to float through the village, quiet ones. Hushed. A boy who sleepwalked to the edge of the woods and couldn't remember why. A baby who smiled at an empty doorway every night at the same time. A lantern seen flickering just beyond the well after sunset, though no one had gone out. Most people dismissed it. They said the dark played tricks on tired minds. They said people dreamed things when their bellies were too empty or too full. They said children made up stories for attention. But Annette didn't say anything. She just listened, because she knew the difference between imagination and a footprint in the dirt. And she had started to wonder if perhaps the child in her dreams wasn't a warning at all, but an invitation. One evening, just before dusk, her brother surprised her. He had been quiet for days, quiet in that watchful, listening way she recognized now. He came up behind her while she was peeling turnips and said, "I saw him too." She didn't need to ask who. He sat beside her on the bench, picked up a peel, twisted it in his fingers. "He doesn't speak, but he knows things. I think he's looking for something." Annette looked at her brother's face, soft in the fading light, eyes a little wider than usual. Not afraid, just wondering. They didn't say much more that night. Some thoughts are best kept quiet until the time is right. That night, neither of them dreamed. But when Annette woke in the morning, she found something beneath her blanket. A small, round stone, smooth, warm to the touch, carved with a faint spiral, like the kind the monks used in the corners of their books. She looked across the room. Her brother was already awake, sitting up in bed, staring at his own hands. In one of them was a feather. Not gray this time, white. Annette turned the stone over in her hand for a long time. It was strange, not just the spiral, but the warmth. Stones didn't usually hold warmth that way, especially not in the early morning chill. It felt as if it had just been resting in someone's palm. Not buried, not forgotten, placed. Her brother, Martin, still sat quietly on the edge of the bed. He didn't say anything about his feather, but he didn't hide it either. He simply turned it over now and then between his fingers, watching how it caught the light from the small window. Neither of them spoke of the boy, not directly. But there was something unspoken between them now. A quiet agreement. They had both seen something. And, somehow, that meant they were part of it, whatever it was. That day moved slowly, like most days in the village. Martin helped the blacksmith's apprentice move some heavy stones to shore up the side of the smithy, while Annette spent the morning inside, helping her mother mix dough and grind herbs. The scent of thyme and sage filled the little cottage, warm and sharp. It was the kind of scent that settled into the wood, lasting even after the meal was long gone. Later that afternoon, Annette wandered toward the chapel with a basket of leftover bread. It was a short walk down a worn path, past a few crooked fences and a row of sleeping goats. Father Roderick often left bread for travelers or anyone in the village who needed it. The basket was light, but she took her time, stepping gently over the mossy stones and fallen leaves. The chapel was small, built of pale gray stones and roofed with faded red tiles. Ivy curled around its walls like it had always belonged there. Inside, it was quiet and cool, the light from the windows casting long golden shapes across the floor. The old priest was inside, hunched over a book, lips moving soundlessly. He looked up as she entered, eyes kind but tired. "Annette," he said softly, "you're up early." She smiled. "Just bringing some bread, Father." He nodded and stood slowly. "Thank you, child. The woods have been noisier lately. Birds restless. Perhaps it will be a hard winter." She hesitated. "Do you think they know things before we do? Animals?" The priest tilted his head. "Maybe. Or maybe they feel what we ignore." She placed the basket near the altar, then lingered. "Have you ever heard of a child? One who appears in dreams, but leaves things behind? Stones? Feathers?" His gaze sharpened just a little. "Not suspicious, just curious." "Not for many years," he said. "They're old stories, though, from before my time, about children who wandered between this world and another. They didn't speak much, but they left signs, gifts, warnings." She swallowed gently. "And the spiral?" He looked toward the stone she still held in her hand. "That's older than any of us. Monks called it the path inward, a way of listening, not walking." Outside, the wind stirred. Leaves rustled like pages turning. That night, Annette and Martin stayed up a little longer than usual. Their mother had fallen asleep early, worn out from mending wool and stitching a torn blanket. The dog curled tightly near the fire again, snoring quietly. They sat near the window, not saying much, just watching. The moon was smaller now, not as full, but bright enough to silver the rooftops and shine faintly on the edge of the trees. Martin finally whispered, "I think he's waiting." Annette nodded. But for what? Neither of them had an answer. When they finally drifted to sleep, the night was gentle, still, and again, the dream came. This time it was not a field, not the forest. They stood in a room neither of them recognized. The walls were smooth stone, curved. A single window let in moonlight. In the center stood a low table, and on it, more feathers. Dozens, all white, some curled, some straight, arranged in a pattern they didn't understand. The boy stood behind the table, watching them. This time, he pointed not at the woods, but at the ceiling. And then, slowly, he placed his hand on his own chest. Over his heart, Annette woke with a feeling of weight on her chest, like a memory she couldn't name. She reached under her blanket without thinking. There was another stone, this one darker. No spiral, but carved with something else. A shape like a tree, small and branching. Her brother stirred not long after. He looked at her wordlessly, then held up what had been left on his side of the bed. A strand of tiny, woven thread, coarse and old, almost like a braid from a doll. They didn't speak. Not yet. They didn't need to. The mystery was deepening, like a tide that slowly crept up your legs before you realized you'd waded too far. And they didn't know yet what it wanted. But they knew it hadn't finished. Not yet. Not even close. The following days passed like a quiet procession, each one marked by small, curious signs that something was changing. Not loudly, not in any way that would alarm the neighbors. But Annette could feel it. The birds flew differently in the morning, circling lower, calling less. The old goat near the chapel refused to drink from the trough, and instead pawed at the ground beside it, as if looking for something. Even the weather seemed unsure of itself, shifting between mild sun and sudden wind, as if the skies were watching too. Martin stopped speaking about the boy in dreams. He didn't have to. The silence between them had changed, no longer filled with questions, but something closer to waiting. Each morning, they checked their blankets and pillows. Some mornings there was nothing. Other mornings there would be a single feather, or a smooth pebble, or once a very old button made of carved wood. The villagers, for the most part, went about their lives untouched. They gathered firewood, mended tools, told jokes near the fire, and prepared for the colder weeks ahead. Life in the village was simple, but it carried a kind of rhythm, one that gave people comfort even when they didn't understand it. No one questioned why the animals had started keeping closer to the barns, or why the wind sometimes whistled strange patterns through the shutters at night. It was autumn. Strange winds came in autumn. But Annette had begun to feel that something unseen was brushing up against their lives, just lightly, like a fingertip tracing the edges of a page before turning it. Late one evening, long after the lanterns were snuffed and the bread had been wrapped and stored, Annette took a walk to the edge of the village. She needed to think, needed air that hadn't been warmed by fire and cooking pots. The moon was nearly gone now, just a curved sliver. The stars blinked above like they always had, steady and unchanged. She followed the narrow path that led behind the cooper's shed, then out to the wide field that sloped toward the forest. The grass was cool beneath her feet. She didn't bother with shoes. She paused halfway to the trees. The woods were still, like they were holding their breath. Annette knelt and touched the soil. Dry, a little cold, and then she saw it. A feather, larger than the others, tucked into the grass at the base of a flat stone, half hidden like it had been gently placed. She picked it up. It was ivory, almost translucent at the edge, and shimmered faintly under the starlight. No bird she knew had feathers like this. She looked toward the forest, but didn't step forward. Something inside her whispered that this wasn't the night. Not yet. The next morning, she told Martin about it. He listened with quiet eyes and nodded once, like he'd already known. He pulled something from under his tunic and handed it to her. A scrap of cloth, finely woven but old, with tiny stitches in a pattern that looked almost like a map. Or veins. Or rivers. It was under my bed, he said simply. They didn't ask each other why these things were happening. They weren't frightened, not exactly. But they had both started sleeping with one ear open, like travelers resting near strange woods. That week, Father Roderick visited their cottage. Not for any special reason, just one of his occasional visits to bless the home before the colder winds came. He spoke with their mother over tea, asked how her hands were holding up, and thanked her for the bread she'd left at the chapel. His voice was steady, but his eyes wandered. He looked at the window, at the fire, at the ceiling, and then at Annette. "Have the dreams found you too?" he asked gently, when her mother stepped outside to tend the chickens. Annette blinked. "You knew about them?" He nodded slowly. "Long ago, when I was a boy, I dreamed of a path through a hill of stone, lined with feathers. A boy walked ahead of me, always just out of reach. What did he want? I never found out," the priest said. "The dream stopped after a while, but I've always remembered the feeling, like something was asking to be remembered." Later, as he left, he pressed something into Annette's hand. It was a small wooden medallion, carved with the same spiral she'd seen on the first stone. "Not to protect you," he said, "just to remind you that not all mysteries mean harm." The nights grew colder, the fires burned longer, and the dreams deepened. Not every night, but enough that they started to feel more like memories than dreams. The boy no longer appeared in fields or rooms. He stood in places Annette almost recognized: a corner of the woods, a stone-lined well, the mossy edge of a forgotten path. Always silent, always watching. Sometimes he held something, a branch, a folded scrap of parchment. Once he held nothing but turned slowly in place, showing the same spiral carved on his back like a mark, faint and almost glowing. Annette began to write things down, not in a book, but on scraps of old paper she found in the back of the cupboard. Pieces of dreams, bits of conversation, the shape of feathers, the symbols. It wasn't a diary, exactly, more like a collection of clues she didn't yet know how to read. Martin began carving small things from wood. At first it was just shapes, curves smooth, then more specific. A tree, a spiral, a pair of eyes. He didn't explain why. He just said it helped. One morning, Annette woke before sunrise and went to the door. Outside, in the thin light of dawn, were 3 stones arranged in a line. Perfectly smooth. One with a spiral, one with a tree, one blank. She picked them up and held them tightly. Behind her, Martin stirred and said softly, "He's getting closer." And she knew he was right. The forest had always been part of the villagers' lives. It gave them firewood, berries, and game when luck was kind. But over the years, it had also become something of a boundary, a place to go only when needed, never for wandering. Children were taught early not to follow its deeper paths. The trees grew thick and tall, and the moss that clung to the roots made the earth feel soft, almost hollow beneath your feet. But now the forest seemed to be watching them. Annette felt it each time she stepped toward the edge of the fields. It wasn't threatening, just aware, as if the woods knew something she didn't. The leaves rustled even without wind. The shadows lingered longer in the corners. The boy had appeared again in her dreams the night before, this time holding a curved stick etched with tiny lines. He pointed toward the stream behind the mill, then disappeared without a sound. When Annette woke, she found a small twig placed carefully across her windowsill, just like the one in the dream. She didn't speak of it to Martin that morning. He had his own dream to carry. Instead, she wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders and walked toward the mill. The miller's daughter, Elsbeth, was crouched near the stream, gathering wild herbs into a small cloth pouch. She stood as Annette approached, brushing the hair from her eyes. "Out early," she said, giving a quiet smile. Annette glanced toward the shallow bend in the stream where the water pooled. "I had a dream," she said softly, "of this place." Elsbeth looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You too." Annette's breath caught. "You've seen him?" Elsbeth nodded again. "Twice now, in the orchard behind the chapel, and once near the old well. He never says anything, just looks, like he's waiting for us to notice something." Annette stepped closer to the water. "Do you think we're supposed to do something?" "I don't know," Elsbeth whispered. "But I started writing down where he appears. The places, they form a shape, a kind of ring." Annette looked up sharply. "A ring?" "Yes. If you connect them on a map, they form a circle. And in the center is the stone tree." The stone tree was one of the oldest things in the village, a strange, jagged, trunk-shaped rock near the base of the hill. No one remembered who placed it there. Some said it had always been. Others said it was the remains of a shrine from a time before churches. Few visited it. The roots around it were too thick, the air too still. But now it seemed important. Later that day, Annette returned home and carefully unfolded one of the papers she had saved. She drew a rough map of the village, the cottages, the chapel, the fields, and the edges of the woods. Then she marked each place the boy had appeared. Her dreams, Martin's, Elsbeth's. She used a piece of charcoal to connect the dots. The shape wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. It circled the stone tree. When she showed it to Martin, he only stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "We're inside it." That thought settled like a shadow across their kitchen. Whatever the boy was showing them, they weren't outside of it. They were part of it. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of old parchment, Annette visited old Widow Bryn. She lived near the north fence, her cottage leaning slightly to one side, as if the wind had tried to carry it off years ago, but gave up halfway. Bryn had lived through 2 village fires, a crop failure, and the strange illness that swept through the valley a decade ago. People said she could read the wind, and that birds followed her because they knew she could see what others missed. Annette brought her a bundle of herbs and some of the fresh bread her mother had baked. Bryn accepted the gift with a grunt, then waved her inside. The cottage smelled of rosemary, beeswax, and thyme. Annette sat across from her, hands folded in her lap. "I've been dreaming," she said after a while. Bryn raised one eyebrow, but said nothing. "A boy keeps showing me things. Feathers, stones, places around the village. He doesn't speak, just watches. Others have seen him too." The old woman's fingers twitched once on her knee. "He's back," she muttered. "You know him?" "Not him." But the story. Bryn leaned forward slowly. There's always been a watcher, a child between seasons. He comes when the circle weakens, when something old stirs. He doesn't warn with words. He warns with signs, because the signs are older than words. Annette's voice caught. What's the circle? Bryn's eyes turned distant. It keeps things where they belong. Not locked, not buried. Just quiet. But when it weakens, the old paths begin to open again. The wind remembers how to whisper. The earth remembers what it carried. Is it dangerous? Annette asked. It depends who listens, Bryn said softly. As Annette stood to leave, the old woman placed something in her hand. A small wooden charm, shaped like a door. If you must follow him, follow with your eyes open. Not all who step inside return the same. That night, Annette, Martin, and Elsbeth met behind chapel. They sat in the grass, cross-legged, a small lantern flickering between them. The wind had changed again, cooler now, carrying the scent of damp stone and something older, like ashes and pine. Elsbeth unfolded her map and laid it beside Annette's. The two maps were nearly the same. Different hands, same pattern, the same silent message. We should visit the stone tree, Martin said quietly. Elsbeth nodded. Tomorrow at first light, before the sun touches the ridge. They agreed, and then sat in silence as the flame danced. None of them spoke of fear. It wasn't fear exactly that sat in their chests. It was knowing that something had already begun, that the circle had been marked, that the boy, whoever or whatever he was, had pulled them into a story older than their village, older than memory. And as the stars above them turned in their slow, ancient rhythm, a breeze swept through the chapel yard, lifting leaves and carrying them in a spiral toward the forest's edge. The morning air was colder than expected. Mist curled along the ground in thin ribbons, clinging to boots and bare ankles. Annette stepped carefully along the path that led past the chapel and toward the western ridge. Each breath came out in pale clouds, and the trees ahead looked like faded shadows behind the veil of fog. Elsbeth joined her first, a thick scarf around her neck and a small pouch tied to her belt. She didn't speak, just nodded once. They waited together in silence until Martin appeared from behind the cooper's shed, holding a lantern even though the rising sun had already started to light the sky. None of them said it aloud, but they all felt it. Something was different. The village behind them felt too still, and the ground beneath them felt slightly softer, like the world had shifted just a little in the night. They took the path that curved past the old orchard, past the half-buried well, and the stone marker that no one remembered placing. The walk to the stone tree was not long, but every step felt measured, like walking through a memory they didn't yet fully understand. The stone tree stood tall and strange at the foot of the ridge. From a distance, it looked like an old trunk, split down the middle and covered in moss. But up close, the details became clearer. Carvings, not letters but shapes, spirals, eyes, curved lines, feathers. Martin touched one of the carvings and drew his hand back quickly. It's warm. Annette reached forward and placed her palm flat against the stone. She felt it too. Not hot, but holding a soft heat like it had been resting in the sun all night. Yet the sky was still cloudy, and no sun had reached it. Elsbeth stepped to the other side and knelt by the roots. Here, she whispered, brushing aside some leaves. Beneath them, half buried in dirt and moss, was another wooden token, just like the one Father Roderick had given Annette. This one was carved with a shape that looked like an open eye, staring. What does it mean? Martin asked. Annette didn't answer. She was staring at something just past the stone tree. A path. Not a trail they had used before, but one that looked like it had always been there, waiting. It was narrow and wound downward into a hollow thick with mist. Trees leaned over it protectively, and the ground was littered with soft moss and thin white feathers. She took a step forward. Elsbeth caught her arm gently. Are you sure? Annette looked down the path. I don't think we're meant to wait anymore. Together, the three of them moved quietly into the hollow. The path bent and dipped, winding like it was drawing them deeper into the story. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer, but the air didn't feel heavy. It felt familiar, like walking through a dream they'd all had at different times in pieces. After a while, they reached a clearing. At its center stood a circle of stones, each one worn smooth by time. In the middle of the circle was a small wooden bench, too new to be ancient, but too weathered to be recent. Martin approached one of the stones and traced its surface. "Look at this," he said softly. "A symbol carved into it, just like the one on his carving from weeks before." Elsbeth knelt beside another stone. "This one, too. It's a match to the charm Widow Bring gave you." And Annette saw her own mark, spiral, tree, feather, all woven together on the stone directly opposite the path. Before anyone could speak, the wind shifted. It didn't blow. It circled, like a breath drawn inward. Leaves rose from the forest floor. A faint ringing filled the air, not quite sound, but not silence either. And standing at the edge of the clearing was the boy. He looked the same as always, quiet, still, eyes like deep wells. But now he was holding something new. A staff made of white wood, long and slightly curved at the top, with feathers tied near the base and a circle carved into the tip. He raised it slowly and pointed it toward the center of the stone circle. Then he vanished. The wind dropped. The ringing faded. The three of them stood frozen, unsure what to do. Then Annette stepped into the center. She felt it instantly, a hum beneath her feet. Not sound, but energy, the kind that reminded her of summer storms just before lightning. Martin and Elsbeth joined her. The hum grew louder, and then it stopped. Just silence. But something had changed. When they turned to leave, the path behind them was different. The trees weren't the same. The moss was deeper. The wind had gone still. Back in the village, hours had passed, though they'd only been gone a short while. The people looked at them curiously, but no one asked questions. That night, Annette didn't dream. Neither did Martin, or Elsbeth. Instead, they all woke at the same moment, just before the first bird called. Each of them found the same thing waiting beside their beds. A feather, a stone, and a ring made of bark, tied with thread. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. For the next few days, the village settled into an uneasy quiet. Nothing unusual happened, at least not at first. The livestock behaved normally. The skies stayed clear. The bells rang on time. But people noticed little things, small shifts that didn't quite make sense. A lantern flickering even when the wind was still. Water in the well rippling with no one nearby. Children forgetting names they knew by heart. Annette kept to her chores but couldn't stop thinking about the clearing, the circle of stones, and the boy with the staff. Her feet remembered that place more than her mind did. Every path she walked in the village seemed to pull her toward it, like the land itself was leaning in. One morning, while gathering eggs near the henhouse, she found a second bark ring tucked under a wooden slat. It was thinner than the first, almost brittle, with 3 tiny red threads wound around its edge. No one else was nearby. No one could have placed it there without being seen. That same day, Elsbeth came to her door holding a cloth bundle. Inside it were feathers, dozens of them, all soft gray, tied together with strips of wool. They were hanging on the fence behind the chapel, she said, confused, in the shape of an eye. Martin, meanwhile, had started hearing things. Not voices exactly, but sounds that didn't belong. A wooden flute playing far off in the night. Soft knocking at his window with no one there. Once, he heard whispering coming from the well, though when he leaned in, there was only silence and the scent of damp stone. The three met again in the orchard at dusk. The trees there were old, some of the oldest in the village, with gnarled trunks and branches that creaked in even the gentlest breeze. They didn't light a lantern. The twilight was soft enough to see by, and they didn't want to draw attention. "I think we're being watched," Elsbeth said softly. "But not by him. By something else." Annette nodded. The circle was a warning. Or maybe a seal. Something to keep things in. And now that it's open, Martin added, things are coming through. The orchard creaked around them. Somewhere nearby, a bird called once and went silent. "We should return to the clearing," Annette said, though she wasn't sure why. "We need to know what we've done, or what we've let out." That night, as she lay beneath her blanket, staring at the low wooden ceiling of her family's cottage, she tried to remember more of the boy's face. But it slipped away like water through her fingers. Only his eyes stayed with her, deep and still, holding something she couldn't name. Not fear, not sadness, Something older. A memory she hadn't lived. The next morning, the three of them walked in silence to the clearing again. The fog was thinner now, but the air had changed. It smelled sweet, almost like honey, and something beneath it, a sharp, sour note like wet iron. The clearing looked the same. The stones, the bench, the earth. But as they stepped into the circle, the hum didn't return. The silence felt different this time, expectant, like it was holding its breath. Annette knelt and placed her palm flat on the earth. It was cold. Then the wind shifted, and something new appeared. From the trees, a figure stepped forward. Not the boy this time. A woman. Her clothes were simple, brown wool, a shawl, boots caked in mud. But her eyes were not simple at all. They were the color of old leaves, deep and turning. She didn't speak. She simply looked at them, then at the stones, and then she pointed up toward the ridge behind the clearing. There, almost hidden in the slope, was an opening. A cave. It had always been there, but none of them had ever noticed it. Or maybe it hadn't always been there. Maybe it had only just appeared. The woman turned and walked back into the trees without a word. The forest swallowed her quickly. None of them wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, Elsbeth whispered, "We're not alone in this." They waited until the sun was high before approaching the cave. It was narrow, not tall enough to stand upright once inside. The entrance was lined with stones, not placed like a wall, but shaped by time, stacked naturally into a frame. Annette stepped in first. Inside, the air was dry and close. The walls were smooth, carved by water long ago. Faint markings lined the stone, symbols like the ones on the charms, repeated over and over in a slow, spiraling pattern. Deeper in, the path widened, and they could all stand upright. The cave opened into a hollow chamber, empty but for a small basin of water at the far end. It was perfectly still like glass. Floating on its surface was a single feather. Elsbeth reached out, but as her fingers touched the water, the feather dissolved. Not sank, not moved, dissolved. The water rippled once, and something shifted in the stone beneath them. A sound, low, deep like a drumbeat in the earth. Then silence again. They stood there a long time, unsure whether to stay or run. But nothing else happened. The chamber stayed still. The water calmed. The marks on the walls faded the longer they looked at them, as though the cave knew it was being watched and preferred to remain forgotten. When they emerged, the sky was darker than it should have been for that time of day. A thin layer of cloud blanketed the village, and the birds had gone quiet again. That night, Annette had her first dream in days. But this time it wasn't the boy. It was the woman. She stood at the stone tree, her hand on the carving of the feather. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Then she turned and looked directly at Annette. Behind her, shadows moved, tall shapes, walking slowly through the trees, faceless but not formless. Annette woke with a gasp, her heart thudding in her chest. Outside, the wind had picked up, and tied to her door was a new charm. This one was shaped like a key, but she didn't have a lock. Not yet. The charm on Annette's door swayed softly in the wind, the threads brushing against the wood like fingers tracing a forgotten tune. The key-shaped loop spun slowly, catching the morning light in a way that made the simple bark look almost silver. She didn't touch it at first. She just watched. It didn't feel threatening, just placed, meant to be there, but it held meaning. That much was clear. By the time she reached the chapel steps, Elsbeth was already waiting. She didn't speak, only held up her hand, where an identical charm hung from a piece of string looped around her fingers. "Mine was under my pillow," she said quietly. Martin joined the moments later, winded from the walk up the hill. He pulled his own charm from his coat. Same shape, same weave, same thread. Mine was on the barn door, hooked right over the latch. I don't know how I didn't see it last night. They stood in silence, each holding the key-shaped charm, each wondering what door it was meant for. The village itself was still calm. Too calm. The rhythm of life continued. Milk poured, bread baked, fields tended, but something lingered under the surface. The air felt heavier, not with fear exactly, but with waiting, as though the earth beneath their feet had drawn a breath and hadn't let it go. Annette visited Father Roderick again that afternoon. The chapel was quiet. Dust floated in the light, slanting through the narrow windows, and the scent of wax and pine filled the air. She found him seated near the altar, staring at the floor. "I dreamed of the old stories," he said before she spoke. "The ones we were taught to forget. The feathered eye, the circle that binds, the song that ends and begins again." Annette sat beside him. "What do the charms mean?" He hesitated. Then he reached under the bench and pulled out a small leather-bound book. Its corners were frayed, the cover cracked from age. "This was passed to me by the one who served before me. I was told never to open it unless I heard the name Annette tied to the feathered one." She stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, voice steady but quiet, "that some stories are older than the village, older than the church. Stories that are kept in memory, not in ink. You were always part of one, whether you knew it or not." She opened the book. The pages inside were covered in symbols, not letters, but lines and marks like those carved into the cave. They danced across the parchment, some drawn in circles, some in rows, all seeming to move slightly when looked at for too long. One page had 3 key shapes drawn together, woven with threads that formed spiral. At the bottom, a single word written in faded script: "Unseal." That evening, the 3 of them returned to the cave. The village was beginning to whisper now. People watched them as they passed, not with suspicion, but with that same quiet curiosity, a shared sense that something was happening, something they couldn't quite name but didn't want to disturb. The trees rustled softly as the trio reached the clearing. The stone circle was unchanged, and the cave beyond stood as silent as before. But this time, when they stepped inside, the markings on the walls glowed faintly, like moonlight on water. They didn't speak. Each of them took their charm and stepped to the edge of the basin. The water was still, waiting. One by one, they placed the charms into the basin. The water did not dissolve them this time. Instead, the surface shimmered. The reflection twisted. The cave darkened slightly, as though drawing light inward. And then the water receded, slowly sinking into the stone, revealing something hidden below. A door, not made of wood or iron, but of smooth black stone, etched with spirals, feathers, and keys. No handle, no hinges, only symbols. Annette reached forward. The door pulsed, just once, and opened soundlessly inward. Behind it was a staircase, winding down, far deeper than the cave should have allowed. The air that rose from the depths wasn't cold. It was warm, and it smelled of flowers, wild ones, soft and sweet, like a field in midsummer. But beneath that sweetness was another scent, faint and strange: burned leaves, distant rain. They descended slowly, each step echoing slightly as they moved. The walls of the tunnel were smooth, but the light came from somewhere unseen. A soft glow lit the way, flickering like firelight without casting shadows. After what felt like a long time, but might have been only moments, they reached a wide chamber. At its center stood a stone pedestal, and on it rested a small wooden box. The box was simple, carved from ash wood, wrapped with thread. No lock, no lid, just one object inside: a bone flute, delicate, pale, smooth as glass. And carved along its length were symbols, familiar ones. The moment Annette touched it, the chamber changed. A deep tone hummed from the walls. Not music, but a single drawn-out sound, like a note played in the heart of the world. The tunnel behind them was gone. Where it had been, now stood a stone archway, and beyond it trees. Not the forest they'd known. These trees were tall, dark, covered in thick moss that glowed faintly blue. The sky above was twilight, not night, not day, just a dim gray blue with no sun, no stars. They stepped through the arch. The moment they crossed, something shifted behind them. The arch sealed. The air thickened. The silence deepened. Here, time felt different. The ground was soft beneath their feet, covered in leaves that didn't crunch, only sighed. The wind whispered in a tongue they didn't understand, but almost did. The trees bent slightly, as if listening. And on a high branch above them sat the boy. He wasn't watching them. He was playing the flute, a soft, strange melody, beautiful and eerie, like a lullaby from another world. When he saw them, he stopped. He didn't smile. didn't speak. He only raised his hand slowly and pointed, not at them, but toward a path that hadn't been there a moment ago. They turned to follow it, but not before Annette looked back and saw that where they had entered, the arch had turned to stone. There was no going back. Not yet. And ahead of them, the trees began to hum. They walked in silence. The path underfoot seemed to move as they stepped, almost as if it were alive, soft and giving, yet certain in direction. The humming in the trees never stopped. It wasn't loud, but it pressed on their ears gently, like a sound just beyond normal hearing, one that settled into the bones more than the air. Every few minutes, the trees would bend slightly, as if they were breathing, like they were aware of every step and watching without eyes. Martin was the first to speak. "Do you think this is a dream?" Elsbeth didn't answer. Her hand tightened around the small charm she had tucked in her sleeve. Annette didn't want to say anything either. She wasn't sure. This place didn't feel like the dream she had known. It felt too quiet, too patient. They walked until the trees opened into a large clearing. In the center stood a figure. Not the boy, not the woman. Someone new, taller than any person they had seen before, dressed in robes made of woven reeds and feathers. The face was partly hidden behind a mask, smooth wood with narrow slits for eyes and nothing where the mouth should be. But the figure didn't feel threatening. It simply stood there, as if waiting for them to arrive, as if it had known they were coming all along. In one hand, the figure held a staff made of ash wood, carved with keys and feathers just like the charms. In the other, it held nothing. But when Annette looked closer, the figure's palm held a faint light, like a flicker of fire, but not burning. The figure raised the staff, and the humming in the forest stopped. All at once, like a breath held by the world itself. Annette stepped forward, her heartbeat heavy and slow. "Why are we here?" she asked softly. The masked figure tilted its head, as if trying to understand the question. Then it lowered the staff and pointed behind them. They turned and saw something new. A door. Huge, ancient, built into the very side of the hill behind them. It hadn't been there moments ago. The door was covered in carvings, spirals, circles, keys, feathers, and unfamiliar faces. The same strange language filled the spaces between the shapes. At the center of the door, one carving stood out. It was a hand, open, reaching upward. The figure stepped forward slowly and placed its palm over the handprint. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft tone rang through the air, low, calm, but strong, and the lines of the door began to glow. But it didn't open. The figure turned to them again and pointed to Annette. It wanted her hand next. She hesitated, heart pounding. Every step toward that door felt heavier than the one before. But her body moved anyway, like the path was already written beneath her. She reached out and pressed her palm against the carved hand. A coldness crept in her fingers. Not painful, just deep. It felt like the stone was remembering her. When she stepped back, the glow brightened. Then the figure pointed to Martin, and then to Elsbeth. Each of them touched the stone. And with every touch, the carvings around the handprint began to shift, softly changing, rearranging themselves into new patterns that shimmered in the still air. But still the door didn't open. The figure turned and walked toward the edge of the clearing, where the ground dropped sharply into a wide hollow. They followed without question now. The humming in the forest had been replaced by a silence that felt even more intense, like a pause before a storm. As they reached the ridge, they saw what lay below. Circles, dozens of them, stone rings like the one they had found in the forest near their village, each surrounded by runes and feathers, charms hanging from thin trees like forgotten prayers. At the center of the rings stood the boy. But now, he wasn't playing the flute. He was standing still, eyes closed, arms at his sides, facing a massive stone structure that pulsed with a soft blue light. It looked like an altar or maybe a doorway. The same symbols from the cave walls danced across it. Around him, other figures stood, not masked, not cloaked, just people, ordinary people, young, old, all dressed in simple clothes like villagers. Each of them held a charm in their hand. Some were shaped like keys, others like feathers. One woman held a charm shaped like an open eye. They didn't move, didn't blink. They were waiting. And then the boy opened his eyes. The light from the altar flared. The forest behind them groaned, an old sound, long and deep, as if something ancient had begun to wake. The masked figure raised its staff once more. This time, the boy began to walk forward. With every step he took toward the altar, the blue light dimmed slightly and the ground trembled underfoot. The carvings along the hillside glowed in rhythm with his steps. Elsbeth gripped Annette's arm. "What is this?" Annette didn't answer. Her throat felt too dry. The door behind them, the one carved with the reaching hand, had started to hum. The sound came through their feet now, through the roots of the trees, through the stone and soil. The masked figure turned to them and finally spoke, but the voice came not from the mouth, but from the air itself. Calm, gentle, familiar. You opened the circle. You must now hold it closed. Annette stepped forward. Why? What is he? What happens if we don't? The answer came not in words, but in memory. Flashes, storms sweeping through ancient hills, fires that danced without wind, villages where no one woke, stone doors sealed with handprints and songs, circles carved to hold something, not evil, not good, but powerful, untamed, forgotten by choice. Annette stumbled back, heart racing. Her head felt heavy with images. Martin caught her by the elbow. What did you see? She shook her head slowly. It's not him. It's what follows him. The boy reached the altar. The wind stopped moving. The trees bowed inward. And from the stone itself came a breath, hot, slow, and alive. The light flickered once, twice, then stopped. Everything froze. They stood there, suspended between what was and what might become, waiting for something to move, to fall, to end. But nothing came, not yet. And in that silence, Annette realized the door behind them hadn't opened, because the final charm hadn't been placed. The masked figure turned again, raised one hand, and in its palm now lay a fourth charm, not shaped like a feather, not a key, but like a spiral, simple, endless. The figure held it out toward Annette. Her fingers reached for it, trembling. The ground pulsed once. A crack of wind stirred the trees. And then, everything held still again, balanced on the edge, waiting. Annette didn't take the spiral charm right away. Her hand hovered just above it, uncertain. There was something different about this one. The key-shaped charms felt like they opened something. The feather-shaped ones, those were protective, soft. But the spiral felt final. Not like an end, but like a folding inward. A turning back, as if by touching it, she might begin something she couldn't undo. The figure said nothing. It simply stood there, waiting. Its stillness was not impatient, but steady, like a tree that had seen many winters and was willing to wait for spring. Martin and Elsbeth said nothing either. They didn't rush her. They only watched, their faces calm, though their eyes carried the same quiet question. What would happen next? With a breath that felt deeper than her lungs, Annette reached out and took the spiral. It was warm. Unlike the other charms, which had been cool and smooth, this one had a faint pulse, like a heartbeat or the memory of one. As soon as it touched her skin, the trees surrounding the clearing rustled softly, as though letting out a sigh. The masked figure lowered its hand and stepped back. No instructions were given. None were needed. She knew what to do. Turning slowly, she walked back toward the great stone door carved into the hillside. It still shimmered faintly, the symbols glowing in time with her steps. The handprint on the door, hers, still glowed, waiting. She pressed the spiral against the center of it. The stone shifted. A soft crack echoed through the air, not sharp, not loud. Just a sound like old earth remembering how to move. The door folded inward like two leaves uncurling after a long sleep. Beyond the doorway was darkness. Not threatening, not empty, just quiet. The kind of darkness that holds space for something to return. She stepped inside. Behind her, Martin and Elsbeth followed. And so did the masked figure, its staff tapping gently against the stone. Inside, the air was still. Not cold, not warm. Just the kind of stillness that felt ancient. The hallway was narrow, curving gently downward. The walls were covered in the same symbols they had seen before, but now they made more sense, like parts of a map, pieces of a language that had been buried under silence. There were feathers here, yes, keys, spirals, but also hands reaching, eyes watching, mouths open in song. They passed alcoves carved into the stone. In one, a bowl filled with black seeds. In another, a small harp made from branches and hair. In another still, a broken mask, much like the one worn by the figure walking behind them. Everything felt ritualistic, but nothing felt cruel. Just old, just forgotten. At the end of the hallway, they found the chamber. It was round, high-ceilinged, with a pool of perfectly still water at its center. The surface reflected the glow of soft light pouring in from cracks in the ceiling above. All around the room, carved into the stone walls, were names. So many names. Annette walked to the edge of the water. She knelt and looked into it. But what she saw wasn't her face. It was the village, their own village. But not as it was now. It was different, older. She saw children playing with charms tied to strings. She saw families gathered under moonlight, placing feathers beneath doorways. She saw masked figures walking openly among the people, not feared, not hidden, honored. And she saw a girl, not her, but someone who looked like her, laughing, standing among the trees, holding a spiral charm. Elsbeth stepped closer and saw a different image. Her own mother, as a child, speaking to someone at the edge of the forest. A woman with long dark hair and a voice like wind through leaves. A song was being taught, one that Elsbeth had never heard but somehow knew. Martin, too, saw something personal. He didn't say what, but his face grew still, thoughtful, a little sad. The masked figure stepped to the edge of the water and dipped its staff into the pool. The water swirled. The reflections vanished. Now, the surface showed the present. The boy at the altar, standing still, waiting. The people surrounding him had not moved, but something behind him had changed. A shape, slowly rising from the earth. Vast, shadowed, formless but alive. Not angry, not kind, just returning. Annette looked at the masked figure. Is it him? Is he the one calling it? The figure tilted its head. Then it reached up and, very gently, removed its mask. They all froze. It was the boy, not as he was now, but older, grown. His face was the same, eyes quiet, tired, gentle. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. The boy wasn't summoning the shape. He was keeping it still, holding it in place, keeping the circle closed. But now the circle was weakening. The charms had been forgotten. The rituals faded, the songs unsung, and so the shape had begun to stir. The spiral was not a symbol of chaos. It was a symbol of remembering, of repeating, of returning to the old ways, quiet, slow, sacred. The boy couldn't hold it alone anymore. He needed others, not to fight, not to stop, but to hold, to remember, to sing. The chamber darkened slightly. The water turned black, and from deep below came a hum, not like before, deeper, older. The masked figure, now unmasked, placed the spiral charm back into Annette's hand. Then it stepped into the pool, not sunk, not drowned, just disappeared, gone like mist burned off by morning light. The water cleared. The boy, still a child, stood once more at the altar, waiting, needing, and behind him, the shape grew slightly taller, still faceless, still watching, still waiting for the balance to shift. Annette turned to Martin and Elsbeth. They nodded. They knew. They had a choice, not to stop something ancient, but to hold the line, to take up the charms, to restore the circles, to remember what had been forgotten. And slowly, they turned back toward the entrance, toward the forest above, toward the boy, because the hum behind them was growing. And if they didn't act soon, the song might break, and what slept below the spiral might wake. The forest above didn't greet them with the same warmth as before. The light filtering through the canopy had dimmed just slightly, not darker, but quieter, as if even the trees were unsure of what came next. The ground, still soft beneath their feet, seemed to guide them without words. And though no path had been carved, the way forward was clear. Each step Annette took with the spiral charm in her hand made her feel both heavier and more certain. It wasn't just a token anymore. It felt like responsibility, like memory, like the truth of something that had been asleep too long. Elsbeth walked beside her, her face serious. For once, she didn't joke or whisper. Her eyes stayed forward, drawn towards something she couldn't name but already trusted. Martin brought up the rear, quiet as always, but his hand never left the pouch where he now kept the feather charm. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat matching the rhythm of the forest. When they reached the clearing again, the masked figure was gone. In its place, the stone door now stood fully open, light pouring from within like a breath let go. The forest around it seemed to lean away slightly, not from fear but respect. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Across the hollow, they saw the boy, still at the altar, still not moving. But something had changed. The people who had once stood silently around him, those others holding charms, the guardians of the rings, were now beginning to fade. Not all at once, not violently, just gently, like candle flames reaching their end. One by one, they vanished, dissolving into particles of light that drifted upward into the trees, carried off by a breeze that no one felt. Only the boy remained now, and behind him, the shape. Larger now, no longer just a shadow. It had form, though it shifted constantly, smoke then stone, then wings, then hands. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a ghost. It was the echo of something old, something made of belief, of memory, of neglect. Annette knew, deep down, they hadn't come to stop it. They had come to remember it, to bear witness, to hold it in place, not with weapons or spells, but with care, with the rituals their ancestors had let go of, with the traditions they hadn't understood but now saw clearly. The spiral was never meant to lock anything away. It was meant to guide, to help something vast and powerful stay still, but only if people continued the old songs. The three of them stepped forward and descended into the hollow. As they moved past the stone rings, something curious happened. The charms that had once hung uselessly from branches began to shimmer again. Keys turned slightly on invisible threads. Feathers lifted in a breeze that had no source. The forest was responding. Annette placed the spiral on the edge of one of the rings. Instantly, the glow returned. The symbols along the stone edge came to life. One of the broken circles reconnected. Elsbeth, without needing instruction, reached into her satchel and removed the charm shaped like a hand. She placed it across the next ring. Again, the carvings shimmered and pulsed. Another circle restored. Martin approached the farthest one. His fingers tightened around the feather before he placed it. As soon as he let go, a tone rang through the hollow, soft, pure, like the pluck of a distant string. The boy turned. For the first time, he looked directly at them. His eyes weren't pleading. They were grateful. Behind him, the shape trembled slightly, but did not grow. Annette stepped forward. So did the others. Each of them now stood on the outer edges of the circles, facing the center. The boy closed his eyes again. The wind stopped, and the trees bent inward once more. But this time, the sound was different. It wasn't humming. It was a melody. Simple, ancient, sung not with voices, but with the forest itself. The trees creaked in harmony. The grass whispered along. Even the stones vibrated softly. And Annette knew the next step. They had to join the song. It didn't need words. It never had. So she closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to hum. Elsbeth followed. Then Martin. Their voices didn't rise above the forest. They blended into it, like memory, like breath. And the circles began to spin, not quickly, but in slow, measured movement, just like the spiral in Annette's hand. The carvings along each ring pulsed in time. The boy at the altar raised his hands. The charms that hung in the trees danced like leaves. And the shape behind him stilled. Its movement slowed. The wings folded in. The hands withdrew, not because it was forced, but because it had been seen, honored, remembered. The earth under their feet trembled slightly once, then again. But the tremble wasn't fear or danger. It was release, like a breath being let go after centuries. The song grew quieter. The symbols faded slowly. The circles stopped spinning, and silence returned. But not the empty silence from before. This one was peaceful, warm, full. The boy turned to them one last time, nodded gently, and stepped back from the altar. Then, without a sound, he vanished, just like the others. Only the altar remained now, and the shape still and waiting, but not dangerous, just held, by memory, by ritual, by care. Annette opened her eyes. The forest looked brighter now, softer. The charms in the trees stayed glowing. The spirals carved into the stones looked newer, fresh, like they had just been etched. And though the ancient force beneath the rings was not gone, it no longer threatened to rise. It had been heard, and that was enough. For now, they turned slowly and walked back through the clearing, up the hill, and toward the path that would lead them home. The forest, alive and humming softly once more, seemed to open with every step. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The story wasn't finished, but it had found its balance again. And somewhere far beneath the soil and stone, the spiral turned once more, slowly, patiently, endlessly, waiting, just in case. The forest trail that led them home was no longer the same one they had walked in on. It wound differently now, just slightly, twisting to the left where it hadn't before, curving around stones that seemed older than the trees themselves. Birds no longer sang, and the wind had grown more deliberate, brushing through the leaves like whispered questions. Annette felt it before she saw anything. A tightening in her chest. The spiral charm in her hand, once warm and steady, had begun to cool, as if pulling away from her touch. She glanced back at Martin and Elsbeth, who had noticed it too. The peaceful stillness they had left behind in the hollow was now unraveling at the edges. As they reached the ridge that overlooked their village, the clouds above them gathered with quiet purpose. No storm broke, but the air was thick with something unspoken. And then they saw it. Smoke. Not the black, violent kind, but pale gray strands rising slowly from the rooftops. Not from fire, at least not entirely, but from something older, ritualistic, deliberate. The people of the village, who had always shied away from the forest, now stood gathered in the square. Silent. Still, waiting. In the center stood the elders. But something was wrong. They wore robes that none of them had seen before. Pale blue, stitched with symbols that didn't match the old ones carved in stone. And in their hands, they held masks. Not the gentle ones from the forest, but angular, cold, shaped like hollow eyes and closed mouths. They were not from the spiral. They were from something else. Something that had grown quietly while everyone focused on what lay beneath the rings. Annette stepped forward, but Martin stopped her with a hand to the arm. "Look again," he whispered, and she did. The boy was there, but it wasn't the same boy. It looked like him, but older, taller, eyes darker. He stood behind the elders, silent, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. It made no sense. The boy had vanished. He had thanked them. He had found peace. And yet here he was different, distant, and seemingly part of the gathering that was now beginning to chant. The sound rose slowly. Not a song, not a memory. A call, a pulling. And suddenly, the spiral in Annette's hand burned. She dropped it with a gasp. The charm hit the earth with a hiss, smoke rising from it like it had touched fire. Elsbeth knelt beside her, touching her shoulder. "Something's gone wrong," she murmured. "Something's out of balance again." Martin stepped ahead of them, eyes locked on the village below. "The circles we restored," he said quietly. "They weren't the only ones." That was when they remembered something the masked figure had never told them. There were more rings, not just in the hollow. Others, hidden, forgotten, and some had not been guarded at all. Behind them, in the forest, the ground gave a low tremor. The birds that had remained scattered in a flurry. From deep within the trees, a new sound emerged, low, broken, familiar. A countermelody to the one they had sung. But it didn't harmonize. It fought. Something was answering the chant from the village. Not the shape they had held back. Something else. Something that had been buried in a different circle. And this time, it wasn't waiting to be remembered. It wanted to be seen. To rise. To claim. Annette felt the pull in her chest. The same pull she had felt when she first saw the boy at the altar. But this was sharper. Hungrier. It wasn't asking to be understood. It was demanding to be obeyed. Elsbeth gripped Annette's arm. What if restoring the spiral, awakened more than we knew. What if it wasn't just a gate? Martin added. What if it was a lock for something much older? The thought left them cold, because now the boy, no, the one who looked like the boy, was lifting his hand. And in his palm, not a charm, a shard, black, jagged, glinting with crimson light. The crowd around him responded instantly. They lowered their heads, raised their hands, and let the chant grow. This was no ritual of peace. This was surrender. Something else had taken hold in the time the spiral slept. Something that had grown not in the hollow, but in silence. In the gaps left behind. In the hearts of people who had forgotten what the old ways really meant. Annette stepped back. We have to return to the forest. Martin nodded. To the rings. Elsbeth hesitated. But what if the rings aren't enough now? That was the question. What if they had only repaired one half of the story? What if while they sang, something else had been listening, learning? What if the boy they saved had shadow? And what if that shadow was never asleep at all? The spiral charm on the ground pulsed one last time, then split cleanly in two. No explosion, no drama, just broken, as if it had done its part and could do no more. The wind shifted again, from the forest, carrying not song, but whispers. And with those whispers came a new sound from deep beneath the earth. Footsteps, slow, rhythmic, heavy, not one pair, many, marching, coming closer. The story wasn't over. It had just begun to remember its darker side. And this time, there might not be enough charms left to hold it back. They didn't speak as they turned from the ridge. No plan was formed, no orders given, but the direction was clear. They had to return to the hollow. Not just to protect what they had helped restore, but to understand what they had unknowingly awakened. As they stepped back into the forest, the trees seemed thinner, the light less dappled. The charm pieces in Annette's hand were warm again, but not pulsing. Just still, like they were listening. The forest did not welcome them this time. It tolerated them. Martin was the first to hear the sound. A faint scraping, like nails against bark, slow and dragging. It came from behind them, though every time they turned, there was nothing there. Annette kept her hand near her pouch, where she'd tucked the remaining charms, though even she wasn't sure what power they still held. Elsbeth muttered softly to herself, half prayers, half memory, words her grandmother used to say when the sky turned copper before storms. As they moved deeper, the forest began to change. Trees grew closer together, their bark darker, rougher. Vines twisted low around their roots, not blooming with flowers but with strange, bulbous pods that throbbed gently like they were breathing. The air turned damp. Still no birds. Then they saw them. Masks. Not hanging this time. Standing. Dozens. Figures in robes made from woven leaves, bark, and scraps of cloth, their faces hidden behind crude masks. Nothing elegant or symbolic. These were flat, expressionless, jagged like they'd been carved in haste. They didn't move. They didn't speak. But they watched. And between them, a new ring. One the trio had never seen before. It was smaller, broken in half, the stones covered in moss and soot. The center of the ring wasn't earth or altar. It was open, just blackness. A hole that seemed to go on forever, but not down, sideways like the world folded in at that point. Annette stepped closer. The masked figures did nothing. But when her foot crossed the edge of the ring, the spiral charm in her pouch vibrated. She stopped, and something below the ring growled. Not loud, but deep. A warning. Martin caught her by the elbow. This one's not like the others, he whispered. It doesn't want to be healed. It wants to feed. Annette swallowed and nodded. Then the wind changed again, brushing the edge of her ear like a whisper, and this time, it spoke her name. Only hers. Clear and sharp. Annette. She froze. The masked figures didn't move, but the vines at their feet began to stretch outward. Not fast. Not hostile. Just reaching. Elsbeth tugged her back, but not with force. With urgency. We're not here to fix this one, she said. We're here to see it. Martin frowned. See what? Annette closed her eyes, trying to listen. Then she understood. This was the first ring. The original. Not made to seal something in, but to bring something through. The charm shards in her hand tingled. She looked down and realized they were pulling toward the hole. not falling in but pointing, like a compass, like a tether. The wind spoke again, quieter this time. Too late. That's when the chanting returned. But not from the forest, from the village, far behind them, but louder now, as if those in the square had found new energy, or perhaps new leadership. The boy, or the version of him that now stood among the elders. And the shard in his hand. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a key, one half of something buried deep. And Annette, holding the spiral, held the other. Without meaning to, they had given the village what it needed to unlock the older magic. The kind their ancestors had once played with before they knew how dangerous it could be. The kind tied to dreams, and sleep, and memory. The kind that didn't distinguish between a ritual and a door. Martin spoke, breaking the silence. There's something moving under the hollow again. I can feel it. Elsbeth stepped closer to the center of the broken ring. We didn't finish the story. Annette looked at her. What story? The one our village told, Elsbeth said quietly. The story we grew up hearing about the forest, the old songs, the boy who vanished. They always said it ended in peace. But what if they left out the ending? What if there never was peace? A rumble echoed from beneath their feet. And far off, toward the ridge, the sound of footsteps. Not animal, not human, something in between. Slow, methodical, purposeful. The masked figures began to retreat. Not running, just vanishing behind the trees like fog retreating from dawn. And then the ring pulsed. The opening in the center flickered, first red, then white, then gold. And then something rose from within. Not a shape, a reflection of the village. Of the boy, of them. A mirror, made not of glass but memory, showing all that had happened, and what hadn't, showing the parts forgotten, the cracks in the song, the faces that were never named, the promises made and broken, and in the center of the reflection, a second spiral, twisting in reverse, dark where the first was light, and it was spinning faster. Annette reached out but didn't touch it, because she suddenly understood. This wasn't just about holding back a force. This was about choice, about which spiral would turn the world forward, and which one would pull it back. Martin took a step back. I think the wrong story is winning. Elsbeth didn't argue. No one did, because the wind now carried the boy's voice. Not a whisper this time, a statement, echoing, certain, I am awake. And just like that, the forest shuddered, and the reflection snapped, and the ground beneath the broken ring cracked. And from below, something vast and unseen began to rise. Slowly, patiently, without fear, the balance was shifting, and the story they thought they had helped complete was only just beginning to remember its end. The ground beneath the ring split wider, sending a tremble through the forest floor that echoed into their bones. It wasn't violent, but deliberate, like something buried for too long was finally making space for itself again. The masked figures were gone. The vines had withdrawn, and all that remained now was the hole, the broken ring, and the reflection that had shown them the truth. Annette stood at its edge, her heart beating fast, but her hands steady. She didn't need to speak. She could feel the choice hanging in the air. Two spirals, two songs, one fading, one rising, and one final moment left to shape which story survived. Martin stepped beside her, the earth shaking softly underfoot. The spiral in Annette's hand had stopped pulling. Instead, it had gone cold, its purpose fulfilled. Elsbeth held the charm fragments close, eyes closed, murmuring words none of them recognized. She wasn't praying. She was remembering. An old lullaby. A forgotten one, passed down in pieces, never fully understood. A song meant for endings. Or maybe beginnings. Then from the broken ring, it rose. Not a creature, not a shadow. A form made of echo and memory. Of every forgotten dream. Every undone ritual. It looked like no one and everyone at once. Tall, thin, cloaked in shifting pieces of the past. Its face was a mask of silence, but its presence filled the air with noise. Not loud, but full, heavy, like the weight of 1,000 nights spent wondering what had been left out of the story. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The forest itself seemed to bow slightly. The spiral charm cracked further in Annette's hand. And then the village chant stopped. All at once, silence swept across the ridge. They turned and saw them, every villager standing still, heads tilted, as if listening to something only they could hear. The boy, or whatever had taken his form, was walking forward. His eyes locked on Annette. His hand, still gripping the shard, glowed faintly. But his steps faltered when he neared the forest's edge. Something, some unseen barrier, stopped him. And then he spoke, clearly, softly. "You gave me peace, but not all of me wanted it." Annette's voice broke the silence. "You weren't the only one in the spiral." He nodded. There were two. They had feared it, guessed at it, but now it was certain. Not a spirit and its shadow, but twins. One seeking rest, one seeking return, and they had freed them both. The being from the ring, tall and shifting, stepped between Annette and the boy. It reached toward the charmed shards, not to take them, but to hold them near. The pieces lifted gently, hovering in the air, spinning slowly. Then they stopped, forming not the spiral, but a key, a different one, not to seal, to choose. Annette realized it in a flash. They were not here to fight. They were here to decide. Which version of the story would be remembered? Which one would take root again? Peace or power? The crowd at the ridge stood frozen. The boy stepped forward again. So did the echo being. Two truths, both born from the same story, both asking to be believed. Elsbeth looked at Annette. "It's us. We choose." Martin nodded. "But once we do, there's no undoing it." Annette looked at the charm key floating before her. Then, without hesitation, she touched it. The forest went still. Time seemed to slow, and a light burst from the charm, soft, warm gold. The boy dropped the shard. He didn't scream. He didn't vanish. He simply paused, then looked up with eyes wide. Not angry, not fearful. Free. The villagers blinked, as if waking from a long dream. The echo being at the broken ring nodded once, and faded. Not vanished, just stepping back. The ring closed in on itself, stone by stone, vines curling over it gently like roots closing a wound. The spiral charm in Annette's hand cooled. Not broken, not cold, just quiet. Then something unexpected happened. From where the boy stood, a second child stepped forward. Identical, but quiet, eyes kind. The real boy, the one they had met first. He smiled, and faded gently, as if returning to where he belonged. It had been the shadow all along. The other had used his face, his story, to call for more. But the spiral hadn't forgotten the truth. Neither had they. As the wind picked up and the trees began to sing again, Annette turned to her friends. They had made their choice, not just to restore the rings, but to remember the story properly, the one with peace. But just as they began their walk back, Elsbeth stopped and pointed. In the distance, where the other ring had stood only moments ago, a new mark had been carved into the earth, a symbol they didn't recognize. Not spiral, not shard, just a question mark, as if to remind them, not every story stays finished. The walk back to the village felt different this time. The trees no longer loomed above them with suspicion. The forest had softened, just enough to let them pass, though still whispering in its own language. Annette walked quietly, her hands still holding the charm, now still and ordinary. It was just a piece of the past again, not glowing, not guiding, just there. Elsbeth walked beside her, humming the lullaby under her breath. Not because she had to, but because it somehow felt right. Martin kept looking over his shoulder, not out of fear, but with a strange curiosity. That symbol, the one carved into the forest floor where the broken ring had been, it stuck in his mind. He didn't speak about it, but it had unsettled him. Not because it was threatening, but because it had no answer. A question mark, left like a seed, buried beneath everything they had just done. By the time they reached the outer edge of the village, the sun had begun to lower. A warm gold stretched across the fields, touching the stone paths and rooftops. The chanting had stopped hours ago, and the villagers were no longer gathered. Most had returned to their homes, as if waking from a dream. Only the elder remained near the village square, standing quietly by the well, her staff resting at her side. She didn't smile when she saw them, but her eyes were soft. "You found the root," she said, voice quiet like worn fabric. Annette nodded. And we made a choice. The elder looked at her closely. Then the stories changed. No, Annette replied, after a pause. I think we just finally told it right. There was a silence then, not empty, but thoughtful. Like the whole village was breathing in and out through the old stones. Like the ground remembered what had been stirred and was slowly settling back down. Children played again in the corner of the square. Their laughter was light. Nothing strange in their voices anymore. No chants, no distant hums. Just play. But in the corner of Annette's mind, one thing still stirred. The boy, not the shadow, not the spirit that had borrowed his voice. The original one, the real child, the one who had been caught between two spirals, whose story had been forgotten or half told, or twisted until even the forest couldn't hold it steady anymore. She wondered, where was he now? Was he part of the forest still? Had he passed on? Or was he simply a piece? It was hard to say, because some parts of history aren't recorded with ink or memory. Some only live in the wind. Later that evening, as the village prepared its evening meal, simple broth, baked root vegetables, flat bread warmed on the stones, Annette sat by the hearth with the charm pieces laid out before her. She wasn't trying to rebuild them. She just watched them quietly, each piece dull now, but carrying weight. These weren't just tokens anymore. They were remnants of choices, markers of paths not taken. Elsbeth joined her and added a small bundle to the fire, dried lavender and crushed mint. The smoke rose gently, soft and sweet, curling around the room like a blanket. The forest didn't close, she said after a while. Annette turned. What do you mean? Elsbeth folded her hands in her lap. It didn't lock up, didn't push us out. It paused, like it's waiting. Annette nodded. Martin entered with a jug of cider and poured 3 cups, setting them down before taking a seat. His face was tired but calm. I don't think the forest is our enemy. I don't even think the shadow was. I think it just wanted to be remembered. They drank in silence after that. The fire crackled. Someone outside sang a harvest song. Not loud, not serious, just simple and familiar. Time moved slowly again. Night crept in, but the village didn't fear it anymore. Sleep came easier. But in their dreams, at least for Annette, there was still movement. A quiet place in the forest where the trees leaned a little closer and the ground hummed low with memory. Where broken stones rested gently beneath layers of moss. And where the question mark had now faded, replaced by a small, carved figure, a spiral again, but turned sideways. As if the story wasn't about ending or beginning, just continuing. In the morning, Annette woke early. The sky was pale, almost silver. She walked barefoot across the dewy grass to the edge of the village where the forest began. She didn't go in, just stood and watched the path that once carried so many questions. The charm hung around her neck now, quiet. The wind brushed gently through the trees, and for a moment, she heard the sound again. Not words, not voices, just a low, rhythmic breathing. The earth, perhaps, or maybe the story. Still alive, still waiting. She smiled softly, turned, and walked back toward home. And somewhere deep within the forest, past the hollow and the stone rings, past where the masks once stood, a child's laugh echoed faintly, light and distant, then faded into the leaves like it had always been there. Forgotten once, now remembered, but never finished. In the days that followed, the village quietly returned to its rhythms. The bells rang again, not in warning or ritual, but to mark the time for bread to rise, for oxen to return from the fields, for sleep to settle over rooftops. And with the spiral silence, something else seemed to happen. Dreams came lighter, more normal, more restful. The strange waking chants were gone, replaced by the old habits. Yawns by candlelight, hands beneath pillows stuffed with dried herbs, families curling together near hearths, listening to the wind rustle thatched roofs. Annette, however, found herself lingering longer in the twilight hours, curious now, not afraid. She had begun to write down what she remembered, page by page, not as a record of what happened, but of how it felt. The broken spiral, the boy's soft voice, the vines that moved without wind. It was all there, scribbled in uneven ink with words that weren't meant for books, but for memory. She knew not everyone would believe it. Some might say the forest simply played tricks on them, that dreams had confused them, that old tales had gotten inside their heads. But she knew better, and so did the forest. It was Elsbeth who suggested they look through the village archives. Dusty ledgers, brittle scrolls kept locked in a wooden chest under the meeting hall floorboards. She wanted to find if the spiral had ever been mentioned before, not just in stories, but in something real, something the historians, or what passed for historians in their little village, might have tried to erase or explain. They found references strange and brief. One record spoke of the sleepless week, where no one in the village dreamed, but all woke at the same hour, whispering a tune none could later repeat. Another scroll, barely readable, mentioned a traveler who claimed the forest could speak if you listened too long at dusk. And in one page, folded between two sheets of inventory, was a child's drawing. Two spirals, one dark, one gold, and a face between them, split with a single line. None of the records were clear, but that was the way of history in quiet places. It wasn't told to be remembered, it was told to be endured, survived, and if possible forgotten. Still, these small scraps comforted them. They weren't the first to feel the spiral's pull, and they wouldn't be the last. One cool evening, with the smell of apples baking in the ovens, Annette wandered to the edge of the village where old Mathis lived. He was nearly blind and mostly deaf, but he had been alive longer than anyone else. His cottage smelled of ink and old wool, and his voice was barely above a whisper. She asked him if he'd ever seen the spiral. He paused for a long time, then tapped the corner of his walking stick against the hearth 3 times. "I saw it once," he said, "but not with eyes." She waited, unsure whether to speak. "It came in a dream," he continued, "when I was a boy. My mother sang to me to keep it away. A song with no words, only breath." He made a soft humming sound. It was the same tune Elsbeth had hummed that night in the forest. "Do you remember what it meant?" Annette asked gently. Mathis shook his head slowly. "No, but I remember the way it felt, like floating between sleep and waking, like a question that had no answer." Annette thanked him quietly and left before the stars came out. That night, she dreamed of the question mark again, not carved, not glowing, just resting in the air like mist. And beside it stood the boy, not the shadow, not the spirit, but the real one. He said nothing, only looked at her as though waiting. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back into the trees. The next morning, Annette went into the woods alone. Not far, just enough to stand in the light where the rings once were. The moss had grown over much of it. The vines had curled peacefully around the stones again. But the air still held that softness, like a page half-turned. She sat there for a while, just listening. Not for voices, not for magic, just for quiet. And in the quiet, she began to think, not just about the spiral or the village or the boy, but about how history works, about how strange it was, the way people forget their past, not in one sharp moment, but slowly, piece by piece, like sleep slipping over the mind. Not erased, just covered. That was how the sleep habits of medieval people had been too, forgotten in fragments. Once they had 2 sleeps, the first sleep and the second sleep, with hours of wakefulness in between, used for prayers, intimacy, quiet reflection. Some would stoke the fire, sit outside, speak to neighbors in low voices under the moon. Then they would go back to bed. No one called it insomnia. It was just normal, natural. And then the world changed. Clocks, schedules, artificial light. The second sleep vanished. People forgot they'd ever done it differently, just like they had forgotten the spiral. She stood and dusted off her skirts. Maybe she thought the forest didn't just hold old magic. Maybe it held memory, the kind that didn't fit neatly in scrolls or stories, the kind that had to be lived through again to be remembered. She turned back toward the village, letting the wind guide her. Birds flitted between branches. The sky stretched wide above, soft blue with drifting clouds. And for the first time in weeks, Annette didn't feel the weight of questions on her shoulders. She still had them, of course, but they didn't pull on her anymore. They were just there, like the stones in the path. Something to notice, not to fear. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. Not to solve every mystery, not to fix every story, but to walk through it, fully awake and ready whenever the next dream might come. The sky that evening was streaked with soft gold, the kind of light that made the village roofs glow like gentle embers. Annette walked slowly, her hands tucked into her cloak, feeling the cool breeze roll across the meadows. She didn't have a destination, just a sense that she should keep moving, keep thinking, keep feeling through the story that still didn't quite want to end. There was something peaceful about how the village had returned to its old ways. There was less urgency now, less whispering. People no longer rushed to find answers. They had accepted that some questions were meant to drift, just like dreams. That night, as she sat by the hearth, Annette began to think more deeply about how people used to sleep. Not just the strange habits, the herbs tucked under pillows, the charms hanging by windows, or the bowls of water left at doorways to catch nightmares, but the rhythm of it, how sleep had once come in two parts, how people used the space in between not to worry or fear, but to live. It fascinated her. There had been records from travelers in the 13th and 14th centuries, people who described entire towns waking in the middle of the night. Some lit candles and wrote poetry. Others walked to neighbors' homes for quiet conversations or helped with nighttime chores. Monks especially followed this pattern, dividing the night between physical rest and spiritual awakening. She imagined it now. Flickering candlelight, quiet footsteps on cold stone floors, the sound of distant bells marking midnight prayers. It was strange by modern standards, but somehow it felt deeply human, as though people had once known how to live with the dark. Not fight it, not fill it with noise or distractions. Just sit with it. Elsbeth joined her by the fire, a basket of fresh herbs in her lap. She had been helping the healer again, drying bundles of rosemary and valerian, tying tiny sachets to hang above beds. "Did you know," she said softly, "that some people believed sleep was when your soul wandered?" Annette looked over. Where to? Places your body couldn't go. Sometimes to find answers. Sometimes just to rest. That's why they left little cups of milk or honey at the foot of the bed, to welcome the soul back gently. Annette smiled. "I would have liked to grow up then." Elsbeth chuckled. "You might have gotten cold feet, stone floors, and no firewood." Still, the thought lingered. A time when sleep was respected, not feared. When it wasn't measured by productivity, but by peace. And then there were the dreams. Back then, dreams weren't ignored. They were messages, sometimes from ancestors, sometimes from the divine. People kept dream books. They talked about them during meals. If someone dreamed of water, it meant change. If they dreamed of a crow, it could mean loss or protection, depending on how it behaved. Not everyone agreed on meanings, but that wasn't the point. It was about listening. Now, dreams were private things. Strange, silent. Forgotten before morning coffee. But in this village, dreams had started to matter again. Especially since the forest. The children, especially, seemed to remember theirs more vividly. Little Marta had dreamt of walking through stars. Tomas said he dreamt he was a fox, running silently through trees that whispered his name. None of them seemed afraid, just curious, like the dreams were part of the day, not separate from it. Martin had begun sketching again, strange symbols, half-remembered images from their journey into the woods. He never showed anyone, but sometimes Annette saw him near the window, quietly turning the pages. Not obsessed, just searching. And the elder? She had returned to her slow walks at dusk, tapping her staff along the cobbled path, humming softly. Some said she was humming the old spiral song. Others thought she was simply marking the rhythm of the wind. One evening, Annette found her standing at the well, staring at the water. "It's all still down there," the elder said quietly. "Everything we've forgotten." Annette looked into the well. It was deep, the water dark and still. "They used to say," the elder continued, "that if you looked long enough, you could see what you were meant to do." Annette waited. The breeze shifted. "What do you see?" she asked. The elder smiled faintly. "Not what I expected, but something I recognize." She tapped her staff once, then walked back into the square, the sound of her steps soft against the stone. That night, sleep came gently to the village again. A little longer, a little deeper, and in that quiet, something subtle changed. There was no final answer, no dramatic revelation, just a shift, a realization that the spiral might never fully close. That maybe, just maybe, it was meant to remain open, not unfinished but breathing, like a story that keeps telling itself, long after the pages have been turned. And it dreamt again of the boy in the woods. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were others, children she didn't recognize, all sitting around a fire that didn't burn but glowed like warm moonlight. They weren't talking, just listening, not to a person, but to the forest itself. And when she woke, she felt rested in a way she hadn't felt in years. She looked outside. The stars were still fading. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't rush to remember her dream. She simply let it stay there, floating, half-remembered. Enough. And maybe, she thought, that was all it needed to be. The seasons slowly changed after the night of the final dream. Leaves turned golden and then fell. Smoke curled once again from every chimney, and the days shortened into evenings that wrapped around the village like a wool blanket. Life resumed, but something within the rhythm of the people had softened. They moved a little slower. They listened more carefully, and they slept more peacefully, not because all their questions had been answered, but because they had made peace with not needing every answer. And it no longer searched for the spiral. She didn't need to. She understood now that it was never really about a place in the woods or a shape on the ground. It was about the old ways, about connection, rest, and the way sleep once flowed like a river through the lives of medieval people. It was about memory and how easily we forget the gentle patterns that once helped us survive the long nights. It wasn't just about dreams or superstition. It was about what it means to be human in a world that moves too fast to notice the quiet between moments. The village, once shaken by mystery, grew calm again. Children no longer feared the forest. In fact, they often played at its edge, imagining secret paths and magical creatures. They no longer needed to be warned away. They respected the trees, but no longer feared them. The air had shifted, and whatever had stirred weeks ago now rested again, folded back into silence. Elsbeth took to teaching the younger children about herbs, not just how to use them for medicine, but how to prepare beds for good sleep. She passed down the knowledge she had learned about lavender and mugwort, about feather mattresses stuffed with goose down, about the ancient belief that a bed should face the moonlight to ease the mind. Her lessons weren't formal, but the children listened. Not because they had to, but because her voice made them feel safe. Martin eventually stopped sketching the spiral. He said the more he tried to capture it, the more it changed in his mind. He turned his drawings into something else. Scenes of the village, faces of friends, and nighttime skies filled with gentle shapes and symbols. He smiled more, laughed sometimes, and began leaving his window open again, just a crack, to hear the wind whisper through the trees as he fell asleep. The elder, too, changed. She no longer walked the village square with urgency. Her steps remained steady, but there was no weight behind them now. One evening, she lit a single candle and placed it at the edge of the forest without a word. Some thought it was a goodbye. Others believed it was a sign of thanks. Either way, no one questioned her. They simply watched as the flame flickered, then went out. As for Annette, she returned to her quiet routines. Washing linens, baking bread, walking the fields in the early morning mist. But something within her had changed. She found herself paying attention to things she once overlooked. The pattern of dew on leaves, the way the birds sang differently at dawn, the soft sigh of her own breath before sleep took her. She kept her little journal tucked beneath her pillow, not to record answers, but to write down moments. Thoughts, dreams, feelings. She wrote about the medieval people she had studied in her quiet hours, how they trusted in the night, how they embraced rest without guilt. She wrote about their rituals, their nighttime prayers, their strange sleep customs that today might seem odd, but once made perfect sense. She even wrote down the stories shared by Mathis and the elder, weaving them into a tapestry of memory that she knew would one day be passed down again. One day, a traveler came to the village. He was quiet, thoughtful, and warm by the road. He stayed a night at the inn and asked if anyone remembered the old songs, the ones that were hummed in the dark. The villagers didn't speak of the spiral. They simply nodded and pointed him toward the forest. He went only to the edge, listened for a moment, and then returned. Before leaving, he told Annette something strange, that he had heard of this place before, not in books or maps, but in a dream of a spiral and a village where sleep still mattered. She didn't tell him everything. Some things, she felt, were meant to be discovered in silence. That evening, she sat by the hearth as the fire crackled low. Outside, the sky was pale blue fading to gray, and stars began to appear one by one. She closed her eyes, breathed in the scent of dried lavender, and thought about how far they had all come, not just in answers, but in understanding. They had remembered something that had almost been lost, not because it was written down, but because it was felt, lived, shared, and that was the heart of it. Sleep was never just about rest. It was a bridge between worlds, between generations, between waking and dreaming. Medieval people knew that. They built their lives around it. They didn't try to conquer the night. They welcomed it, honored it, moved through it gently. And now, here in this small village, that old wisdom had quietly returned. When Annette climbed into bed that night, she didn't wait for dreams. She didn't search for meaning in the dark. She simply let herself drift, knowing that sleep would find her, as it always had, softly, slowly, and with care. Just like it had for those long-ago villagers who slept beneath stars and thatch, trusting that the night held something sacred. And as her eyes closed and the fire dimmed to a warm glow, the village slept too. Not in fear, not in confusion, but in peace. The spiral, somewhere deep in the forest, rested too. Not gone, not forgotten, just waiting for the next dreamer, for the next story, for the quiet breath between then and now. And maybe that's all it ever wanted to be. A gentle reminder to rest, to listen, to remember. Sleep well. The end.